Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. As many of you know, I have been really interested in, as I think all of us have been, in COVID-19 vaccines, treatments, tests, etc. And I came across a company that some of you may have heard of that has developed a antibody treatment a antibody therapy that acts as a synthetic immunity to COVID-19, and it's called bamlanivimab. And we're joined tonight, I apologize, I really messed that up, by the CEO of this BC company. His name is Dr. Carl Hansen, and he says we can call him Carl, so I'm going to call him Carl. Carl, welcome to our show. How are you?
I'm great, Brian. Thanks for having me on the show.
So tell me, I understand that your company, AbCellera, is a Vancouver-based company. You've developed this antibody treatment. It could be saving lives. It's been approved by Health Canada. It's actually been dosed in something like 400,000 people in the United States. And for some reason, we're not using it in Canada. What's going on?
It's a great question, Brian. Bamlanivimab, that's a mouthful. It's difficult to say, is an antibody that we discovered last year in March. It's an antibody that was discovered from a patient that had been infected and then recovered from COVID-19, so part of the natural immune system. That antibody was developed with our partner, Eli Lilly, a global pharmaceutical company, and we managed to go from the first discovery to testing in humans in 3 months, which was a speed record in the industry for developing antibody therapies. That antibody therapy then was tested in humans, and in November was granted emergency use authorization by the FDA, which is the Food and Drug Administration of the United States of America, probably the foremost regulatory body in the world, and Health Canada. And soon after, we had purchased bamlanivimab here in Canada. Despite that, because of decisions that have been made at the provincial level, that antibody, which was approved by our regulatory body and purchased by the government, has remained on shelves since December. And over that time, we've had at least 70% of the cases of COVID-19 that Canada has suffered through the pandemic, and probably about half of the deaths. So there's a very serious problem and some hard questions to be asked about why it is that we are not using that therapy when south of the border it has been used in, as you said, about 400,000 patients.
400,000 patients. And what's the problem? Are there side effects? Are there issues that we weren't expecting in those 400,000 people?
Not at all. Actually, the clinical data, which is mounting all the time, now well over 5,000 patients, has shown this therapy is incredibly safe. As I mentioned, it's a natural protein that it was made by a human body in response to COVID-19. So it's a very safe drug. And it has been shown in clinical trials to reduce the chance of people going to the hospital, if given early, by 70 to 80%. And most importantly, over these 5,000 people in clinical trials, not a single patient that got treated with bamlanivimab early in infection ended up dying. So there have been 0 deaths for bamlanivimab in clinical trials that have read out to date. So the weight of evidence is overwhelming. The reasons for it not being used in Canada, are hard to decipher. The excuses that have been given are that the data is early, which is partly because we're moving fast in a pandemic, but the data now is overwhelming. There's also been an excuse that it's difficult to do, but that's hard to reconcile with, as you said, the large availability in the United States with over 400,000 doses. So
difficult to do. Difficult to what? To actually get it into the body, or difficult to supply it to hospitals, or what?
Well, bamlanivimab, it's a drug that's given by an infusion, which means that you need a nurse to hang a bag and then you inject it into the vein. That's a process that takes about 15 minutes today. Early on, it took about an hour. So it's not as easy as some therapies to administer. There are some logistical challenges, but they're by no means insurmountable. And what we've seen is that in the States, they have steadily increased the availability and the fraction of patients that can benefit that actually get the drug. Whereas here in Canada, we haven't even begun to try to deliver it to patients. So there's a lot of opportunity still to get what is a life-saving therapy out to patients.
What a shame! This is unbelievable. Now we all heard that former President Trump got a antibody treatment. Was it your antibody treatment that he got?
President Trump was one of the first people to get a treatment. It was actually prior to the emergency use authorization. The one that he got is a drug that's being developed by another company called Regeneron. It's a very similar type of therapy. Again, it's an antibody therapy. That is another therapy that is available and is also being used in the United States. So there are two therapies being used quite broadly in the US. Only one of those currently has authorization here in Canada. That's ours, bamlanivimab, and thus far it is not being used.
Unbelievable. We're chatting tonight about a antibody treatment that is approved in Canada by Health Canada, approved in the United States by the FDA. It can save lives, and for some reason, it's not being used by the provinces in Canada. We're going to take a break and come back just after messages with more on this. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Dr. Carl Hansen. He is the CEO and co-founder of AbCellera. AbCellera is a Vancouver-based biotechnology company that has developed a monoclonal antibody treatment for COVID-19. I'm not going to pronounce the name of the drug. I'm going to ask him to do so. And it's approved by Health Canada. It's approved by the FDA. In the United States, over 400,000 people have used this treatment. Not one of them has died, according to the CEO, and yet it's not been used in Canada. Health Canada approved it. Health Canada or the government of Canada purchased supplies, but the provincial governments across Canada aren't making use of it. And, logically, it would be helping people with COVID-19 and saving lives. This gentleman has got, an unbelievable background. He has a Bachelor of Applied Science from the University of British Columbia. He's got a PhD from Caltech in the United States. He's a co-founder and director of Resolution Diagnostics. He was a co-founder and director of Precision Nanosystems. He's for 15 years been a professor or adjunct professor at the University of British Columbia. And in 2012, he co-founded and he's the CEO of AbCellera. Quite a impressive background, Carl.
Thank you, Brian.
How did you get into biotech and pharmaceuticals and antibodies?
That's great. It's a bit of an autobiographical question. I actually started my career in engineering and mathematics at the University of British Columbia. Actually grew up in Edmonton and then moved out west to study. Following completion of what was, I like to frame an arduous and long undergraduate training, decided that there must be easier ways to make a living than in mathematics and physics. Was interested in biotechnology, and so went down to Caltech for my grad studies and was able to be part of a team that was developing technologies that could accelerate the process of researching and finding drugs. And that work began by sort of combining engineering with computation, with methods from biology, which led to some commercial activities. And then finally, I made my way back into academia and then spent about 15 years continuing on that path, building technologies. And it was from that work at UBC that we finally launched AbCellera back in 2012, which was aimed at making it faster to find a certain class of drugs, which are monoclonal antibodies, by being able to search, decode, and analyze natural immune systems. And of course, that has led us to our work in infectious disease. And over the past year, our work on COVID-19, which resulted in the therapy that's difficult to pronounce, bamlanivimab.
So let's break this down if we could. Tell us, please, what is a monoclonal antibody?
Sure. So antibodies are basically Mother Nature's solution to infection and disease. And the way that it works is that within your body, you have at any time maybe 1 billion different immune cells that are called B cells, and each of them can make a different antibody. When your body...
Sorry, did you say 1 billion?
Yeah, approximately 1 billion different immune cells, and each of them makes...
1 billion different immune cells.
That's right, yes. So if you were to look like within your bone marrow or your blood, you'd find a huge diversity, a huge number of these cells. And what is interesting about these cells is each of them makes a completely unique antibody. And when your body encounters a pathogen, like a virus, like COVID-19, some of those cells will have an antibody that can stick to it and that can block it. And those cells ultimately produce these antibodies to protect you. So antibodies are the proteins that are made and optimized by your body in response to vaccination and that protect you from infectious agents such as viruses.
But not only produced by vaccination, but produced by the actual infection, I guess, is what you're saying.
Absolutely, yeah. So if you encounter the virus naturally through infection, as you recover from that infection, you will have made many different types of antibodies that stick to the virus, and some of them will be incredibly potent at stopping the virus. That is what bamlanivimab is. When we went to find it, we searched through the blood sample of a patient that had naturally recovered from COVID-19 and found that 1 in a million cell that makes an antibody that can very potently stop the virus in its tracks. And then we manufactured that, and we now can give it to patients as a synthetic version of immunity to protect them if they have not been vaccinated, or if they're already infected and a vaccination doesn't have time to give them protection.
How did you find it?
We found it with our technology. We've developed over the last 9 years a technology that essentially lets you take a blood sample and in a single day use a combination of microscopy, so imaging, and machine learning, so artificial intelligence, to analyze images of those cells and determine which of the millions that you look at has an antibody with the properties that you're after. We did that for the COVID-19 work over the course of 3 days, looking through about 6 million cells. From that, we found about 2,000 cells that make antibodies against the virus. We then go and make those in the lab and we see which one works the best. And from that, we distilled it down to a single molecule that now has been produced and is being used in hundreds of thousands of patients south of the border.
Fascinating. So I used to be in the blood plasma fractionation business. And I think lots of people are familiar that there's lots of different things in blood that could be beneficial. Are antibodies in blood?
Absolutely. So, one of the probably the oldest possible therapeutics is what we call passive serum transfer, where you would take serum from someone or even an animal that had recovered from a disease and give it to a patient. And in fact, during the early days of the COVID-19 outbreak, there were efforts to use convalescent serum, so the serum of patients that had been infected, and collected and then given to a patient that was infected to help them. The active ingredient in that serum is antibodies. Of course, if you take a serum sample, there's many other things. It could also include infectious agents, which you don't want. And you're also giving all the antibodies, and only a very small fraction of them will be useful against the virus. So with modern technology, what we can now do is find not take all the antibodies, sort of a big sort of soup of antibodies, but rather say, here is that special ingredient that works very well in stopping the virus, and manufacture it so it's absolutely pure and safe, and so that we can give it at scale and know exactly what we're giving to every person. That's what a monoclonal antibody is.
How do you manufacture it?
To manufacture antibodies, what you normally do is you start with the DNA sequence, and then you put that into cells that you grow in these big vats. It looks very much like if you're brewing beer. So these 20,000 liter bioreactors, and the cells act like little manufacturing units that create the antibody and put it into the medium, and then you purify it out and then prepare it in a pure preparation that can then be injected into a patient or infused.
And so it gets shipped out in what, into a little bag or something?
When it's shipped, it normally comes in a little vial, and in the pharmacy, you take it out of the vial and you mix it into saline solution. And then that solution is then given to the patient through an injection and an infusion.
And you say that there's 2 that have been approved in the United States. Are there more around the world that have been approved, or just the 2?
Yeah, to my knowledge, there are only 2 that have been granted emergency use authorization. There are 3 now. So one is bamlanivimab by itself. One is bamlanivimab being combined with another antibody that's called etesivimab. And the third is a combination of 2 antibodies that I mentioned before is being marketed by a company called Regeneron. And that is the one that was given to President Trump early in the pandemic response.
You know, when he got it, there was a lot of controversy that he sort of got special treatment. And some people wondered whether he would have recovered as quickly as he did or at all if he hadn't got that antibody treatment. Maybe you need to give it to emergency compassionate use to someone political in Canada to get approved.
I hope that's not the case. I mean, in Canada, we certainly pride ourselves on equality of access to therapies, and I hope that we continue to maintain that standard, broadly. We have a situation now where one of the greatest disparities in access happens at the 49th parallel. If you live 60 kilometers south of Vancouver and you get sick, there are options to get treated right away and options that are very effective. If you live north of the 49th parallel here in Vancouver, those options don't exist, and they don't exist across all of Canada. And of course, that's something that is heartbreaking because we know that it could make a difference for patients.
It is, and I was being sarcastic with my comment. Hopefully,
I know you were.
But how do we break this? Like this sounds dumb, frankly. That you've got this product. It's being used in the United States. It's saving lives. It's been approved in Canada, and for whatever reason, there's not one province that's using it. Not even one.
There is, as of just very recently, there is one study that's being done here in British Columbia. And that is a study that is seeking to prove that we can, in Canada, deliver this therapy effectively, as has been done in the United States. That's to my knowledge, by far the largest number of doses that have been given and continue to be given on a regular basis. Apart from that, just a handful of cases across the country. And yeah, that's a problem that needs to be addressed.
So if I got sick with COVID and wanted to get it with compassionate use or emergency use or something like that, could I petition Health Canada for that?
If a patient gets sick, it's not obvious to me that there is a reliable way to get access given the decisions that have been made in the different provinces. We are aware of a patient here in Vancouver, a patient that was aware of the work that AbCellera had done. And when he became very ill in the hospital after catching COVID-19, advocated strongly for use, and through persistence was ultimately able to get it. And fortunately, recovered quickly from the disease. So there are certainly examples. There are probably others that I'm not aware of where patients have been well informed about what the options are and have not taken no for an answer. But sadly, that's the vast minority of cases, and that's not how healthcare is supposed to work. You're supposed to be able to be offered the effective therapies that are on hand if you're sick, and it should be the doctors that are bringing them to you, not you having to make your own case for that treatment. So,
if it takes 15 minutes or even an hour for the nurse to get the infusion into someone's arm and to infuse it, I can understand that there's a cost issue, but cost and hassle can't be the issue when we're talking about people's lives, can it?
No, it can't be. And in this particular case, the therapies we have in Canada have already been paid for. So, that cost has already been paid. And the way that this therapy works, it needs to be given early during infection. That's when it's most effective. So say within the first 10 days. Of course, it takes some resources and some initiative, and probably that's what's lacking most, to be able to get organized, to be able to deliver it to patients. But when you put that against the cost of hospitalizations, the burden on the healthcare system, the potential long-term, damage that COVID can do in long-term, COVID patients, and then of course, the loss of life, which in these patients that are authorized for use is anywhere, from 2 to 3% or higher of fatalities from COVID. It's clearly not a cost issue. It's more of an issue of someone taking the leadership position to make this happen.
It's astounding to me. Now, I think what you said was that it is effective both as a vaccine as well as a treatment. So if you take it before you get COVID, you won't get COVID, or what? When you get it, you'll fight it more quickly, more effectively.
Yeah. So the way to think about it is as synthetic immunity. So bamlanivimab, this antibody therapy, has been tested in 2 use cases where it's proven to be very effective. One is in prophylaxis. So that's the case you just described, where someone at high risk would take the therapy in order to prevent getting infected. A phase 3 study was done testing the effectiveness of that on long-term care patients, so elderly patients in long-term care homes. And in that scenario, it proved to be effective in reducing the chance of getting sick by about 80%, so very effective. That use case has not been authorized yet in Canada for use or in the US. The authorization is instead for patients that are at high risk. These are people that are over 65, that are obese, or that have other comorbidities or reasons why their immune system is compromised. Maybe they're cancer patients, maybe they've had organ transplants. And those patients can get this therapy in the early days of infection. And if they do, it makes a very significant difference on the chance of them going to the hospital. It reduces that between 70 and 80%. And as I mentioned before, in the clinical trials, it has resulted in no deaths from COVID-19 if they got treatment early. And that's probably one of the most important things to recognize here, particularly given how many deaths we've had since December, all the while this therapy was sitting on the shelves.
Now, you were very careful to say if they got it early in the infection. Is there an issue if they got it later in the infection?
Yeah, so the studies have not been done to say exactly what is the latest time you can get it to be effective. What has been done is in the early days, antibody therapies were tested as therapies for people that have already become very ill and are in the hospital and maybe perhaps are even intubated. And antibody therapies of all kinds have proven to be ineffective at the late stages of the COVID-19 disease. The reason for that is likely that at that point, there's been significant damage and inflammation in the lungs. And the problem is no longer about fighting the virus. It's more about dealing with the inflammation. So antibody therapies work exceptionally well early, and actually the earlier, the better. So if you could get it the day of being exposed, that's probably the best scenario. Of course, it's difficult to know that you're infected, but certainly within a few days of a positive test is the optimal scenario.
But, this is interesting because what you're saying is it's a synthetic immunity. So it's a synthetic immunity and it's a therapy after you've been infected. Yeah. So isn't this actually better than a vaccine because it acts like a vaccine and it acts like a therapy?
It's better than a vaccine in the sense that if you become sick with COVID-19, a vaccine will not help you because a vaccine will require weeks in order for your body to respond and mount the protection. This is not a replacement for vaccines. This is a tool that works alongside of vaccines. And one of the big reasons is that an antibody therapy requires, a procedure that takes 15 minutes. It's a therapy that's more expensive to manufacture. And actually, there doesn't exist enough manufacturing capacity to cover a population. So vaccines work because you can give them broadly to the population and you can have a large number of people that are immune. Antibody therapies they need to be more targeted towards those people that are at very high risk, that will not respond to vaccines, or that are at high risk and have already been infected. And there they can make a big difference.
Can you give me a sense of the differential in price between a vaccine and an antibody treatment?
Absolutely. So the current antibody therapies are being sold for about $1,200 a dose. A vaccine, is typically on the order of $10 to $20. So it's a very big difference in the cost of the therapy. And that reflects the complexity and the cost of goods as well in manufacturing. An antibody therapy requires, nearly a gram of protein. A vaccine requires, less than 1,000th of that amount. So it's much, much less for a vaccine because a vaccine works by making your body make the antibodies for you.
Right. So, but with a vaccine, you got to get it. And then you got to, a lot of the things are saying it's not efficacious for 3 weeks or so. And then to get the complete efficaciousness, if that's a word, I don't know, you got to take the second dose sometime between 4 weeks and 4 months thereafter. And as you say, that vaccine is what is prompting the body to create the antibodies to fight off the virus. And what you're doing is you're actually providing the antibodies that will both fight off the infection as well as, if you are exposed to it, as well as fight the virus if it actually got in your body as a therapy. So while far more expensive, your product is a lot more powerful.
I think there's a case to be made for that. I think I would come again to emphasizing that probably the most important long-term tool for fighting a pandemic is vaccination. And the reason is that vaccines can be scaled up to billions of doses. You can envision, although it's very difficult to do it, to get a vaccine into the arm of a large fraction of the people on planet Earth. An antibody therapy, if you're at high risk or if you've been exposed, is preferable and has some major advantages. It's more of a foolproof way to get immunity, because you've basically given that synthetic immunity directly into the bloodstream. But it's not a tool that can be used as broadly as vaccines.
Okay,
so
I accept that it can't be broadly, and so therefore maybe we can't afford it to give it to everybody. But just to push this point here, if I was a wealthy person living in the United States where it was available, I'd go get it, wouldn't I?
You absolutely would. And in the United States, it's being made available broadly through the government at no cost to patients. So you don't need to be a wealthy person. You just have to be informed and present yourself at the hospital with the right risk factors that make you eligible for the treatment.
And can you get it before infected, or do you have to be infected?
It's currently authorized only for mild to moderate infection, so after infection.
You know, this is unbelievable. I think this is a huge travesty that the Canadian government and the provincial governments in Canada aren't making use of this monoclonal antibody treatment that Dr. Carl Hansen and AbCellera has developed, that is approved, and it's working in 500,000 plus people in the United States and Canada, and yet we can't get it. It's a travesty. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Carl Hansen in just a minute. Stay with us.
Thanks, Brian.
Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Having what I think is really one of the most interesting conversations about COVID-19 and therapies that I've had with the CEO, Dr. Carl Hansen of AbCellera, which is a Vancouver-based biotechnology company that has developed a monoclonal antibody treatment, bamlanivimab, for COVID-19. And effectively what he says is that it creates a synthetic immunity if you take it before you've gotten COVID-19 and or after you've got COVID-19 and you got the infection. It is a therapy, particularly if received early on in the process, that has had 0 people die as a result of it, because it's curing them. But has to be taken early in the process before I guess COVID-19 has a chance to really damage the lungs irreparably. Carl, you know, it sounds astounding to me that 500,000 people in the United States are using it, and it's not being used in Canada. What have you done about this?
Thanks, Brian. Just before I answer that question, I just want to make sure that I corrected one point, or at least was very precise on it. Bamlanivimab has been tested in clinical trials with over 5,000 participants. In those clinical trials, patients that have been given bamlanivimab early in infection, that has resulted in no deaths. So as far as the clinical trials go, there have been no deaths. I think we don't know if generally when it's used, there have been no deaths, and likely, you know, some have happened. But one can infer from that it dramatically reduces the chance of both hospitalization and death if given early. And that's the important message.
But it has been used in 500,000 people. Is that correct?
It's been used in, you know, probably over 400,000. It may well be 500,000, and certainly 500,000 or more for antibody therapies in general. You know, in the clinical trials, what was shown is that for every 52 people that get the therapy, in the patients that are authorized to get it, you save a life. And that's actually a point that was recently made by the CSO of the Biden administration's COVID therapeutics task force on national television in the United States, imploring patients to be aware and to make sure that if they get sick, they seek treatment. Whereas here in Canada, those patients that want treatment can't get it because it has not yet been made available. You asked me what we've done about that. We first became aware of that, in December when someone very close to us had a family member get sick. We assumed you'd be able to get treatment. We found that you couldn't. We found that was the case across the entire country. And we started reaching out to every member of government, provincially, nationally, to doctors, to physicians, trying to get attention on this issue. And that resulted in, next to no action or no action at all. So it's been a very frustrating process. The one, I think, real highlight of that was a local doctor, Greg Haljan, who took it upon himself to set up a trial to be able to prove that we can do that here in the country. And that one is going forward. But otherwise, to my knowledge, very little access here in Canada.
And what have they told you?
Well, the claims for not using it, have really fallen into three camps. The first was that the data did not support the use. That was hard to understand, given that the FDA in the United States and Health Canada and our federal government and a national task force that was assigned directly to look at therapeutic products called the COVID Therapeutics Task Force all recommended use. But at the province, there were people that said the data was not sufficient for them. So they were taking the position that they needed, a higher bar than these other agencies. It is certainly true that the early data back in November was not at the level one would normally have for approving a drug, but we're in a pandemic. So in a pandemic, you move quickly. And what's more important is that since then, there have been numerous studies that have shown beyond any doubt that if given early, this is a therapy that can reduce hospitalization by 78% and can save lives. So the argument about data, I think, is or should now be put to rest, although people still have been making that claim. The other argument was that it was difficult to deliver, and it does take some effort to set up the infusion sites, but that's an effort that was made successfully in the United States. And as you said, nearly 500,000 people have been treated, whereas in Canada we have not even begun that effort. So that doesn't really wash. And the third one is that people were claiming that it would divert resources from treating COVID-19 patients in hospital or from rolling out vaccines. It seems to me that keeping people from getting sick and ending up in the hospital is a pretty good way to take pressure off of the medical system. And in the early days, there was no vaccine to deliver. So it certainly wasn't the case, in December that therapeutic antibody delivery would have diverted any resources away from vaccines. So, it's all quite hard to understand.
I'm sorry. I'm really at a loss here. We've closed down the whole economy. That's an exaggeration. That's not true. But we've locked down all of Ontario. I think BC has gone through a similar lockdown. And the justification is that the infection rates are so high that the ICUs are going to be overcrowded. And so we've got to tell everyone to stay home, and we close down all the restaurants and all the barbers and all the gyms and all the everything. And it sounds to me like rather than doing all that, all we need to do is give everyone that presents themselves at the hospital infected your drug. And we wouldn't have to close down the economy.
Well, I think that,
I'd rather spend $1,200 on everyone that gets infected by giving them an infusion over 15 minutes or an hour of your monoclonal antibody and keep every small to medium-sized business across Canada open and operating and profitable and employing people.
Well, I'm certainly sympathetic to that. I think it's very important that we always weigh, the cost of all these decisions, getting people back to work, getting our economy going, giving people that security in their life is very important. I don't think that I would ever recommend that people not take precautions to avoid spreading the virus. things that include social distancing, some reasonable restrictions that always needs to be balanced. It's a difficult issue. And of course, vaccination.
But if you got infected, you would take this antibody, right?
Oh, yes. So despite all these efforts that we have done, people are getting infected all the time. And in fact, here in BC and across the country, we have the highest levels of infection we've had since the beginning. And if I got sick, or maybe even more to the point, if my parents got sick, who are in their 70s, I would move hell or high water to make sure that they got treated as soon as possible. If you're in that age category, your chance of being hospitalized is like 16%, and fatality rates are north of 6%. So it's very dangerous. And if you do not get treated early, there really is not much we can do. So it's a very important thing.
Randy, let me understand your clinical trial. You said 5,000 people were in your clinical trial. The way I understand clinical trials is you randomize people into two different arms. One arm would get your monoclonal antibody, and another arm would get a placebo. Is that correct?
That's normally how a clinical trial is done. That's right.
Yeah. Is that not how your trial was done? So I would have thought 2,500 people got your drug, and 2,500 people did not get your drug.
So a couple of things maybe to clarify. So first, AbCellera is a biotechnology company here in Vancouver. We work on the front end of drug discovery, and we do not typically do clinical trials. Instead, we partnered with Eli Lilly, and they have been running the clinical trials in the US. So it's Eli Lilly that is the sponsor of those trials. In those trials, as you said, about 5,000 patients, a little bit less than half were placebo originally. Now, what I want to emphasize is based on the results, Eli Lilly is no longer doing any placebos for any clinical trials of antibody therapies, because they believe that to withhold treatment from a patient that would get a placebo that wouldn't get the treatment is unethical.
I agree.
Cause harm.
With your number, I think what you said is someone from the CDC said for every 52 people that got this antibody, one life was saved, which if my numbers are right at 2,500 people, or you said slightly less than half, so let's say it's 2,000 people, that means that there were 40 people in the placebo arm that died.
If they were all high risk, that would be right, but I don't have those numbers in front of me. But that's the kind of calculation that you could do for these people at high risk. It's about 2%.
I'm sorry, if you've got a clinical trial and one arm with the placebo, 40 people die or whatever it is, and in the other arm with your drug, no one dies, that's got to be pretty compelling.
It is, yeah. Compelling is exactly the right word. I mean, if you look at the statistical analysis and the differential in hospitalization, the differential in death, there are not many drugs that are as obviously having an effect as antibody therapies in COVID-19. So it's a very, very easy analysis to look at that and say, yes, this is something that is safe and that is keeping people out of the hospital and saving lives. And that data has been in hand since November, the early data, but certainly since January.
I'm going to rate my local minister of health tonight. This is unbelievable. Carl, what about the variants? Lots of people are worried that vaccines aren't going to work with variants. Would the antibodies work with variants?
The variant question is great. I was just thinking as you're asking that about your previous question, I want to maybe correct something. So that 5,000 patients, in some of the early trials, the patients were not all high risk, and so the mortality rates were lower. So I think I haven't gone back to those studies, but the number of patients that died was certainly less than 40, but it was certainly in the tens. So it's still a very apparent difference. I just want to make sure that I get that clear in case there's people out there listening. In terms of the variants, you asked a really important question. So there's early on in the pandemic, we had one goal, and that was to move at light speed to get something into clinical testing and ultimately manufactured and out to patients to help keep people out of hospital and save lives. That was bamlanivimab. It's a single antibody. We knew that by moving that quickly, we wouldn't have the final solution. And in particular, that the virus would mutate, would change over time as it moves through the population. and that there was a chance the virus would change in a way that would make bamlanivimab no longer work against variants. For that reason, we have started trials testing bamlanivimab combined with another antibody. And in the United States, that has proven, exactly the right thing to do, because in the United States, there were variants that came up that were resistant to bamlanivimab, and we've now transitioned to a combination that together can cover 99% of all the cases in the US. Now, here in Canada, that variant that exists in the US is not here. And so or it's not here at very high levels. So the reality today is that the major variant of concern in Canada is the UK variant, the one that came from the United Kingdom originally. And that one is effectively hit by our antibody. So bamlanivimab works for about 95% of all of the variants, as well as the original strain here in Canada. And for me, that means we've got an opportunity to take those drugs that we've bought and that are on the shelf and help patients across the country.
We chatted tonight with Dr. Carl Hansen. He's the CEO of AbCellera, who's developed, it's a Vancouver-based biotechnology company that's developed a monoclonal antibody for COVID-19. And it's approved in Canada, but for some reason, we're not using it. It's a travesty, and we're going to have to pay some attention to this. We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're having a chat tonight with Carl Hansen, Dr. Carl Hansen. He's the CEO of AbCellera, who have developed a monoclonal antibody called bamlanivimab. No, I did that wrong, which is an antibody therapy that acts as a synthetic immunity and a therapy to cure COVID-19. And he's been approved by Health Canada. He's been approved by the FDA. Over 400,000 people have used it in the United States. But for some reason, we're not, even though the Canadian government has bought it, we're not making it available for use in Canada. At least the provinces aren't. And I think it's a huge travesty. We're going to come back to that in a minute. But Carl, I've heard, really good, exciting things about monoclonal antibodies. Some people think that we could actually come up with a cure for cancer through something comparable. Tell me, what do you think the future is of monoclonal antibodies? Well,
monoclonal antibodies are actually, a very well-established and very important class of therapeutics generally. In fact, as of today, there are hundreds of approved therapies that are based on monoclonal antibodies. Many of those are in cancer, including some of the most exciting therapies that help to enhance patients' own immune systems against cancer to remove them. Antibodies are used in therapies such as ophthalmology to fight blindness. They're used in cardiovascular disease, infectious disease, as in COVID-19, cancer, neurodegenerative disease, and beyond. So this is, the work on COVID-19 is a very high profile example, but antibodies generally are a precise and effective way to use Mother Nature's own solution in fighting infection and disease to help in a variety of different indications.
Mother Nature's own solution. Sounds fantastic. Carl, are you private or public? Can I buy your stock?
We are a public company. We listed on the NASDAQ actually just last year in December. And of course, we'd welcome your interest, Brian.
What's your market cap?
I haven't checked. It's probably somewhere around 7 or 8 billion.
I'll have to buy you. I'm astounded that the government has made, the provincial governments have made the decision that they've made. I think it's a travesty that we're not able to get this into people's bodies to cure COVID-19. What should people do about this? What can we do about this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's really three, main calls to action that we hope will resonate with people. One is that we want people to understand what antibody therapies are and how important they are in treating COVID-19 early in infection. And as I mentioned earlier, this is basically like a potent dose of synthetic immunity that, if given early in disease, can dramatically reduce your chance of ending up in hospital and of dying from COVID-19. So that's something that, knowledge is power. If people know that, they will at least be able to ask for that therapy, or ask their local government why it isn't available. The second thing that I really want people to focus on is, other scientists out there, people who understand what is going on, that they step forward and make it known that this isn't right. That when we have a therapy that was developed in Canada, that has been approved by the Canadian government, that is being used broadly and to good effect south of the border, that it's important that patients here in Canada also have access. Of course, I actually should have said is authorized here in Canada. The official word authorized, not approved, but authorized for use in response to COVID-19. And the last thing that's most important is those that do have the power, those that are making the decisions that are keeping this therapy from getting to hospitals. I would beg them to have a look at the most recent data, look at the recommendations of other countries, look at the impact this is having south of the border, and then let's figure out how we can, take action to help those that are still getting sick every day.
Carl, Dr. Carl, I think this is just a travesty that the governments haven't been making use of the product that you've got authorized in Canada, that you've got approved in the United States, that's being used in the United States, that's saving lives in the United States. And to add insult to injury, we've had so many problems with the vaccine rollout in Canada, and issues in regards to our own local national supply of vaccines or developers of vaccines. Here you are, a Vancouver-based biotechnology company that created this antibody treatment, and we should be using it. So Dr. Carl Hansen, CEO of AbCellera, thank you so much for raising this issue with us. Really appreciate it. And for anyone that's listening, you know what? We've got to raise a stink about this. Our government should be using this, and we should be saving lives with this Canadian-made monoclonal antibody treatment. Thank you, Carl. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Brian.